Biology and Ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we're discussing the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, or what neuroanatomists call cranial nerve 10, is an extremely interesting nerve because when we hear the word nerve, we often think of a small, connection between one thing and another, the wires of the nerve, which of course we call axons. If you didn't know that, now you know, they're called axons. But actually, the cranial nerve is an extensive pathway. It's a whole set of connections that link the brain and body. In fact, in many respects, it looks kind of like its own nervous system within the traditional nervous system of the brain and the spinal cord, the connections between spinal cord and muscle. The vagus nerve is so vast, it spreads out through so much of the body, and as you'll learn today, it's connected to so many interesting different brain areas and has so many interesting different functions that it deserves, an entire episode of this podcast. The other great thing about the vagus nerve is it is highly actionable, meaning what you will learn today, if you already know something about the vagus nerve, is going to change what you know and believe about the vagus nerve. What you hear today will also, if you don't know or you're not familiar with the vagus nerve, is going to educate you on the latest about the vagus nerve. We've learned a lot about the vagus nerve and ways to control the vagus nerve in the last few years. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the information that you're going to learn today includes actionable tools that will, for instance, allow you to make yourself more alert when you want to, without the use of pharmacology. It will allow you to calm yourself down quickly when you want to, on demand and quickly, without the use of pharmacology or devices. And it will also allow you to alter your mood for the better, and indeed to improve your ability to learn. The vagus nerve is that important. It's involved in that many different things. And the pathways of the vagus nerve, as I mentioned, have been charted in more detail in recent years. And the ways that we can get into the vagus nerve and stimulate its actions in specific ways to achieve those endpoints of improved mood, deeper relaxation, fast relaxation, elevated levels of alertness, and on, are now very well understood. So as you can probably tell, I'm extremely excited about today's episode because the vagus nerve is just one of the most fascinating aspects to our nervous system. You have one, I have one, so let's figure out how they work and how to put it to work for the better. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, today's episode does include sponsors. Our first sponsor is Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium in the correct amounts, but no sugar. Proper hydration is critical for optimal brain and body function. Even a slight degree of dehydration can diminish cognitive and physical performance. It's also important that you get adequate electrolytes. The electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, are vital for functioning of all the cells in your body, especially your neurons or your nerve cells. Drinking Element dissolved in water makes it very easy to ensure that you're getting adequate hydration and adequate electrolytes. To make sure that I'm getting proper amounts of hydration and electrolytes, I dissolve one packet of Element in about 16 to 32 ounces of water when I first wake up in the morning, and I drink that basically first thing in the morning. I'll also drink Element dissolved in water during any kind of physical exercise that I'm doing, especially on hot days when I'm sweating a lot and losing water and electrolytes. Element has a bunch of great tasting flavors. I love the raspberry, I love the citrus flavor. Right now, Element has a limited edition lemonade flavor that is absolutely delicious. I hate to say that I love one more than all the others, but this lemonade flavor is right up there with my favorite other one, which is raspberry or watermelon. Again, I can't pick just one flavor. I love them all. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement.com/Huberman, spelled drinklmnt.com/Huberman, to claim a free Element sample pack with a purchase of any Element drink mix. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free sample pack. Today's episode is also brought to us by Juve. Juve makes medical-grade red light therapy devices. Now, if there's one thing that I have consistently emphasized on this podcast, it is the incredible impact that light can have on our biology. Now, in addition to sunlight, red light and near-infrared light sources have been shown to have positive effects on improving numerous aspects of cellular and organ health, including faster muscle recovery, improved skin health and wound healing, improvements in acne, reduced pain and inflammation, even mitochondrial function, and improving vision itself. What sets Joovv lights apart and why they're my preferred red light therapy device is that they use clinically proven wavelengths, meaning specific wavelengths of red light and near-infrared light in combination to trigger the optimal cellular adaptations. Personally, I use the Joovv whole body panel about 3 to 4 times a week, and I use the Joovv handheld light both at home and when I travel. If you'd like to try Joovv, you can go to Joovv, spelled JOOVV.com/Huberman. Joovv is offering an exclusive discount to all Huberman Lab listeners with up to $400 off Joovv products. Again, that's Joovv, spelled JOOVV.com/Huberman to get up to $400 off. Okay, let's get familiar with the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. The vagus nerve is very different than the other cranial nerves because whereas it does have connections with areas on the face, head, and neck, and deep to those areas too, so throat, etc., it also has connections, or I should say it receives and provides connections to areas within the body. In fact, it has connections with the head area, the neck area, the chest area, the abdomen, and even a bit lower into the lower intestines. So the vagus nerve is super extensive in terms of its outputs and its inputs. And I'll explain what I mean by outputs and inputs in just a moment. But what's very useful to understand and visualize in your mind a bit, anytime we're talking about the vagus nerve, is we're talking about a nerve of many, many different pathways that both receives and provides information from essentially all areas of the body down to the base of your pelvis. And that stands in stark contrast from the other cranial nerves, which tend to receive information from restricted areas of the body, most typically the head and neck area, and that tend to provide connections to the head and neck area. The word vagus actually translates more or less to vagabond, which means wandering. So early neuroanatomists saw that this nerve, cranial nerve 10, had connections to large areas of the body and head and neck and received inputs from lots of areas of the body and decided to call it essentially the vagabond nerve or the vagus nerve. Now, even though the word vagabond means essentially wandering, and the word wandering kind of suggests random, there is nothing random about the wiring of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is incredibly precise in terms of where it receives information from and where it provides information to. Now, I want to be very clear what I mean about information. Okay, if you're a biologist, you'll probably understand some of this. If you're not, and I have to assume most of you are not, it's still very important that you understand, and it's very easy to understand, that your nervous system, your brain, spinal cord, and of course your nervous system includes all these cranial nerves, including the vagus nerve, are carrying different types of information along different pathways. Different neurons or different nerve cells within the vagus nerve, for instance, are receiving or giving different types of information for different purposes. For instance, there is sensory information carried by neurons, nerve cells in your nervous system. Sensory information is the kind of information that, for instance, converts light into electrical signals at the level of your eyes. Then your eyes are providing information to the brain about what's out in the visual world. That's sensory information. The same could be said for sound waves. That's sensory information that your auditory system converts to basically your understanding of speech and sound and music, etc. Other neurons control motor functions, literally the movement of your limbs by controlling contraction of your muscles, or the movement of your lips, or the closing or opening of your airways, for instance. So motor information, of course, can be seen on the surface of the body. I'm moving my hands now, I'm moving my mouth. You don't even need to see me do that to know that I'm doing that. But within our body, we have organs that also need motor control. For instance, our gut. Our gut is not just a passive tube through which food moves. The gut is contracting and relaxing. It's moving food through from one end to the other. Okay. We have our pancreas, we have our liver, we have our spleen. And you might think, oh, well, those are sort of vegetative organs. They just kind of sit there. Maybe the cells do stuff, but they don't move much. But actually, your spleen even has a contractile ability. So it can contract to release red blood cells or immune cells into circulation and so on and so forth. Different organs, including your muscles, but other organs as well, need instructions as to when they should move, when they should contract, when they should relax. So we have sensory information that's carried by essentially one set of neurons in our nervous system. So carrying light information or sound information, or as you'll see in a few minutes, chemical information about the acidity of the gut, for instance. And we have neurons that are considered motor neurons. They control the contraction of muscles or the contraction of these different organs or the encouragement for different aspects of the digestive tract to contract or relax to move food along. Okay, so we've got sensory neurons and we have motor neurons. And then there are a lot of other neurons as well that we call modulatory neurons that kind of adjust the balance between the sensory information and motor information. We aren't going to talk so much today about modulatory neurons, but they are an important third category of neuron in the nervous system. Now, why am I telling you all this stuff about sensory and motor? Because the vagus nerve is also unique in that it is both a sensory pathway and a motor pathway. And this is something that most discussions about the vagus nerve, in fact, I would say 99% of discussions about the vagus nerve that you see online or when you hear about, forgive me, in your yoga classes. By the way, I'm going to touch on how yoga and ancient yogic practices actually managed to tease apart some very important functions of the vagus nerve without knowing any of the underlying mechanisms. But it is the case that most of the time when you hear about the vagus nerve out there in the general world or in the media, it's about the vagus nerve being a calming pathway that's involved in transmitting information about the sensory milieu of the body. So, heart rate, acidity of the gut, how comfortable we are in our body to our brain. And people will say you want to activate the vagus nerve because you want to calm down. Well, that is true, but that is just one small fraction of the functions of the vagus nerve. Why? Because the vagus nerve includes both sensory and motor neurons within it. And while it is true that a ton of sensory information is coursing up from the organs of the body into the brain through what we call the vagus nerve, there's also motor information coming from the brain to the body. So if we are going to have an accurate, meaningful, actionable conversation about the vagus nerve, it's very important that you know that the vagus nerve contains sensory neurons as well as motor neurons. And I want to be clear that I'm not just telling you about sensory versus motor neurons in the vagus nerve to just overload you with nomenclature. Turns out that if you want to access the calming aspects of vagus nerve activation versus the energizing effects of vagus nerve activation versus the immune enhancing effects of vagus nerve activation versus the ways that you can improve learning using vagus nerve activation, you need to know whether or not you're trying to activate a sensory pathway or a motor pathway within this vast set of connections that we call the vagus nerve. Okay, so I want to just briefly describe the sensory pathways within the vagus nerve. And by the way, if you're a yoga teacher, if you are a therapist, if you are a teacher, if you are a human being on earth, this information is going to be very useful to you because this is the information that will allow you to understand why it is that when your body is in a certain comfortable or uncomfortable state, it has a particular effect on your mind and your brain to feel, well, in general, comfortable or uncomfortable. Your vagus nerve includes very interesting and kind of unusually shaped neurons. Okay, the neurons of the vagus nerve are not like the ones that you see in the typical picture if you were to look up neuron online. If you were to look up neuron online, what you would find is you'd see a picture of what's called a cell body where the nucleus, the DNA is. You'd see what are called dendrites, which typically are the area where neurons receive input. And then you'd see the wire-like extension that we call the axon out to the area that that neuron communicates with. And then you might see a little picture of some little blobs or what we call vesicles being released at the end of that axon. That is not at all what vagal nerve neurons look like. Some of them do, but the vast majority, about 85% of the neurons in the vagus nerve, have a cell body with that DNA, with the nucleus in it, sitting in an area kind of near your neck and back of your head, sort of what we call the brainstem. And it's called the nodose ganglion. Now, the nodose ganglion is a collection of cell bodies of neurons. So you can think of it kind of like a cluster of grapes. And they do indeed have an axon extending from them, a wire that goes out to the body, okay? That wire looks for all the world like the axons on any other neurons. And that little axon can be very short if it terminates, as we say, in an area of the neck. It can be slightly longer if it terminates in the chest area, and even longer if it goes to what we call our viscera, our lungs, our pancreas, our liver. down to any number of different organs within our major abdominal body compartment. Okay, you also see an axon, a little wire from a vagal sensory neuron out to the spleen. Now, what I just described, a cell body with an axon extending from it out to the organs of the body, different organs of the body tend to be innervated by different neurons. Not always, but in general. But here's what's different about these vagal neurons. These vagal neurons have another axon that goes from the cell body. So they're what we call a bipolar neuron. They have another axon that extends up into the brainstem and terminates in generally one of three different what we call brainstem nuclei, which are just areas of the brainstem. So this is very important to embed in your mind, right? Because in reality, embedded in your head and neck, or in your brain and neck, are these neurons, which are kind of like a cluster of grapes that have, each one is going to have two branches, one that goes out to a particular organ of the body, and another branch that goes up into your brainstem. Now, this visual understanding, which hopefully is starting to take place in your mind, is extremely important to understand how 85% of the vagus nerve works. 85% of the vagus nerve works by having these neurons that have axons in, say, the spleen or around the lungs, or that innervate the heart, or that innervate any number of different organs in your body. And they collect sensory information about what's going on in each and every one of those organs. That information goes up the axon. Remember, there's the cell bodies in the nodose ganglion, and then it goes further up past the cell body into the brainstem. Okay, so when people talk about the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, as being a sensory pathway, it is mostly a sensory pathway. It's collecting information through these axons. Why is that weird? Well, it's not weird, but it's different than the way we normally talk about neurons, where the axon is the output end, right? Where it's dumping stuff onto the next neuron to make things happen. The neurons in the nodose ganglion of the vagus nerve, I know that's a lot of language, but these neurons that send an axon branch out to the organs of the body are collecting information about what's happening, what sensory information is occurring out at those organs. And that information goes up those wires, past the cell body and into the brainstem, and then that's communicated to the brain. So basically, we can think of 85% of the vagus nerve, this huge superhighway from the body to the brain, as being sensory. And when we talk about sensory, it's important that you understand that two types of sensory information are coming in through these wires, through these axons, and that are delivered to the brain. And in response to that sensory information, as you'll soon learn, your brain will change its levels of alertness. Sometimes it gets more alert, sometimes it gets calmer. Sometimes it primes you to learn better. Sometimes it will turn on a fever. Right? It will literally heat up your entire body based on what those axons are sensing out in the periphery. The periphery, of course, being the organs and tissues of your body outside your brain and spinal cord. So I realize that's a bit of neuroanatomy. For those of you that aren't familiar with neuroanatomy, it might seem like an overwhelming amount of neuroanatomy, but it's extremely important to have that idea in your mind of sensory information flowing up into the brain from your organs, because anatomically speaking and functionally speaking, it runs exactly opposite to how we typically see neurons when they're drawn in diagrams for us, and how we talk about neurons as just putting stuff out at the level of the axon at the end of those wires. Information's coming up those wires in the case of the vagus. Okay, so whereas for the visual system or the auditory system or for the smell system or the taste system, typically we have one type of sensory information coming in. So for instance, in the visual system, light, photons of energy are converted into electrical signals that the rest of the visual system unpacks to give you visual perceptions, to control your circadian rhythms. Or in the case of the auditory system, you have sound waves, which are transduced by this beautiful mechanism of your inner ear that then gets converted into your understanding of speech or music, etc. In the case of the vagus nerve, the sensory information coming from your organs, from your lungs, from your gut. And by the way, your gut, when I say that, I don't just mean your stomach. I also mean the large and small intestine and all the stuff above your stomach as well. The sensory information that's coming from the body includes both chemical information and mechanical information. Now, the mechanical information is pretty straightforward to understand. If your gut is full of food or air or water and it's very distended, you can feel that. The reason you can feel that is because you have mechanoreceptors that sense stretch in the lining of the gut and send that information by way of those axons up to and past the nodose ganglion. There's some processing of that information in the nodose ganglion, but then it goes up and into your brain stem. Okay. Now, also within the gut, you have chemical information. There's information about, for instance, and we'll talk more about this later, how much serotonin is in the gut. You may have heard that 90% of the serotonin in your body is manufactured in the gut. And indeed, it's manufactured in your gut. It plays an important role in gut motility and gut health. The serotonin in your gut is distinct from the serotonin released in your brain. Later, we'll talk about how the levels of serotonin in your gut are conveyed to the brain by way of, you guessed it, the vagus nerve. And your brain, in turn, makes different levels of serotonin to impact your mood. Super interesting, super important pathway, has relevance for depression and just for everyday mood and well-being. We'll talk about it. It's a highly actionable pathway. Super cool. So you have mechanical information and you have chemical information coming from, for instance, your gut up through the sensory, in the technical nomenclature, it's called afferents. Afferents is a technical language. Feel free to ignore this, but for those of you that want to know, you aficionados already know this. The afferents are the inputs to a structure. Efferents are the inputs from a structure. But what we've got in the case of the gut is mechanical and chemical information being sensed by different neurons with different receptors that pay attention to different things, meaning those receptors are activated by either mechanical stretch or by the presence or absence of particular chemicals in the gut, how acidic the gut is, and that information goes up, processed a bit in the nodose ganglion, and then relayed up to the brainstem. And we'll talk in a moment about what happens to that information after it lands in the brainstem. Now, chemical and mechanical information is also being conveyed from other structures in the body. You can probably imagine what some of these are, and we don't have to go through each and every one. But as one additional example to the gut, I'll just use, for instance, the lungs. When your lungs expand and contract as you breathe, that information is relayed up through and past the nodose ganglion and up into the brainstem. And as you can imagine, your lungs, because you're inhaling oxygen and you're also offloading carbon dioxide, your lungs are expanding and contracting. Your lungs are also communicating mechanical and chemical oxygen-carbon dioxide ratio information up to the brain. Now, if we wanted to, we could explore and discuss every single organ of your body that gets axon input from the vagus nerve and therefore can carry sensory information up the vagus. And again, there's going to be information about the chemical environment and the mechanical status of each of those organs carried up to your brainstem. We're not going to do that now for sake of time, but it's very important that you now take a step back and you realize, I understand what sensory information is. I understand that it's different than motor information. It's carried by different neurons in the nervous system. The vagus nerve has both sensory and motor neurons. The sensory neurons are collecting information from all these bodily organs. And by the way, those bodily organs don't just stop at the level of the lungs. It includes the heart. It includes some stuff that's happening in the neck, some of the muscles that are controlling the constriction of the airways. We'll get into this a little bit more in a few minutes. But you now also know that when we talk about collecting sensory information from the body and sending it to the brain by these vagal pathways, that the types of sensory information include both chemical and mechanical information. And the reason that's important is not just academic and intellectual. It's not just to fill the airspace with nomenclature. It's because if you're going to think about ways to change the activity of the vagus system, the ways to, for instance, calm down, or the ways to improve your immune system function, or to improve your mood in the short and long term, you need to ask yourself, am I going to do that through a mechanical change? Or am I going to do that by making a change to the chemical milieu of a given organ or set of organs? So to drive the point I just made home, let's take an example that we see a lot out there, which is that if you want to increase the activity of your vagus nerve, you want to calm down. Why am I saying calm down? I neglected to say earlier that, by the way, every medical student and pre-med student should know, which is that cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, is classified as a parasympathetic nerve. Parasympathetic refers to one branch of the so-called autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls your levels of alertness and your levels of calm. It has two major branches. One branch is called the sympathetic nervous system. It has nothing to do with emotional sympathy. The sympathetic nervous system is generally responsible for increasing our levels of alertness. Everything from being alert like I am now, all the way up to full-blown panic attack, which fortunately I'm not right now. The parasympathetic nervous system is often referred to as the rest and digest system. And indeed, it has roles in rest and digestion, but it controls a lot more than just that. The parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system controls, for instance, digestion. It controls our ability to fall asleep at night. If the parasympathetic nervous system is overly activated, it can make us sleepy when we don't want to be sleepy. It can make us pass out when we don't want to pass out. It can be responsible for putting people into a state of coma. So it's not good to think about the sympathetic nervous system simply as fight or flight, how it's often referred to, because it's also responsible for generating healthy, wakeful, non-anxious, non-stressed levels of alertness, as well as stressed out, panic states. And the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for putting us into a calm and relaxed state, or a deep sleep state, or a coma state if it were to be hyperactivated. The autonomic nervous system is a seesaw where the levels of alertness and calm that we experience at any one moment reflect the relative balance of sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system activity. They're sort of in a push-pull with one another. Increase the parasympathetic nervous system activity a little bit, you get a bit calmer. Increase the sympathetic nervous system activity a little bit, you get a bit more alert. But they're always both active. The vagus nerve is classified as a parasympathetic nerve. However, it's a bit of a misnomer because, as you'll soon realize, there are pathways within the vagus nerve that, were you to activate these pathways within the vagus nerve, you would become more alert, not less alert. This is one of the things that I'm hoping to dispel through the course of this episode, which is this very common myth out there. It's almost pervasive that when you activate the vagus nerve, you're going to calm down. It is simply not true. Okay, there are instances where that is true. There are instances where the opposite is true, depending on which branch of the vagus nerve you happen to activate or suppress. One example, however, where activating a particular branch of the vagus nerve does indeed lead to more relaxation is the branch of the vagus nerve that, again, is sensory, okay? So it's taking information about mechanical phenomenon, in this case, pressure or touch, and it's sending that information down into the brainstem areas that are going to interpret that information. This branch of the vagus nerve that is carrying sensory information doesn't come from the viscera or the neck, it comes from the head. And it's the branch of the vagus nerve that essentially goes behind the ear and in some of the deeper components of the ear. Remember, they tell you don't put anything in your ear that's smaller than your elbow. Well, I'm breaking that rule right now, and I'm putting my index finger into my ear and kind of rubbing in a circular way that kind of the area right outside the hole of the ear. There's a branch of the vagus nerve there. There's also, as I mentioned, a branch of the vagus nerve behind the ear. And were you to rub behind the ear just gently or, with a little bit of pressure, indeed, you're going to activate that branch of the vagus nerve. That branch of the vagus nerve is carrying sensory information, so that mechanical pressure is being conveyed into the brainstem. And indeed, that pathway satisfies all the criteria of being a parasympathetic or calming-inducing pathway. Now, you can find all over the internet that, rubbing behind the ears is really going to calm us down and really bring our level of overall autonomic arousal way, way down. In reality, it doesn't bring our overall level of autonomic arousal way, way down. It brings our level of autonomic arousal down a bit, depending on how active our sympathetic nervous system happens to be. Why do I tell you this? Well, I'm not trying to rain on any parties out there, but the truth is, if you're super stressed, if you're in a panic attack, rubbing behind your ears might help a little bit, but it's not going to suddenly bring you into a state of calm. Soon we're going to talk about things that can bring you into a state of calm very fast, and I will explain exactly how they work and why they work so quickly and why they are so robust. I don't want to be disparaging of the area behind the ear or the area within their ear. Some people really like their ears rubbed. I certainly like the area behind my ears rubbed like I'm doing now, or the areas within my ears gently rubbed. Who doesn't like that? And indeed, it's calming. But it's one minor branch of the vagus nerve carrying sensory information. It's not going to suddenly shift your autonomic nervous system. It's not going to suddenly tilt that seesaw into parasympathetic dominance, as it were. To do that, you need to leverage some of the other more robust branches of the vagus nerve. And I'll teach you how to do that in just a moment here. The point is that the vagus nerve does carry sort of classic parasympathetic information. If you're asked on an exam, med students, I don't want to be responsible for you getting this wrong. I'd love to be responsible for you getting it right. I teach neuroanatomy to medical students. If you are asked, is cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, parasympathetic or sympathetic, you should answer parasympathetic. If you're asked if it's sensory or motor, you should say it's mixed. It's both. So it's mixed parasympathetic. However, for everybody out there, med student or not, just understand that when you activate certain branches of the vagus nerve, you're either going to get an elevation in alertness, that is an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, or a decrease in alertness, that is an elevation in parasympathetic activity, depending on which branch you activate, and the context matters. So if you want to relax, you can rub behind your ears, you can rub inside your ears. If you have permission, you can do that to the person next to you if they like it. But it's not the case that activating any branch of the vagus nerve is going to calm us down. That's simply not the case. And in a moment, I'll tell you why. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, AG1. AG1 is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that also includes prebiotics and adaptogens. As somebody who's been involved in research science for almost 3 decades and in health and fitness for equally as long, I'm constantly looking for the best tools to improve my mental health, physical health, and performance. I discovered AG1 back in 2012, long before I ever had a podcast, and I've been taking it every day since. I find it improves all aspects of my health, my energy, my focus, and I simply feel much better when I take it. AG1 uses the highest quality ingredients in the right combinations, and they're constantly improving their formulas without increasing the cost. In fact, AG1 just launched their latest formula upgrade. This next-gen formula is based on exciting new research on the effects of probiotics on the gut microbiome, and it now includes several clinically studied probiotic strains shown to support both digestive health and immune system health, as well as to improve bowel regularity and to reduce bloating. Whenever I'm asked if I could take just one supplement, what that supplement would be, I always say AG1. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman. For a limited time, AG1 is giving away a free 1-month supply of omega-3 fish oil along with a bottle of vitamin D3 plus K2. As I've highlighted before on this podcast, omega-3 fish oil and vitamin D3 K2 have been shown to help with everything from mood and brain health to heart health to healthy hormone status and much more. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman to get a free 1-month supply of omega-3 fish oil plus a bottle of vitamin D3 plus K2 with your subscription. Today's episode is also brought to us by Roka. I'm excited to share that Roka and I recently teamed up to create a new pair of red lens glasses. These red lens glasses are meant to be worn in the evening after the sun goes down. They filter out short wavelength light that comes from screens and from LED lights, which are the most common indoor lighting nowadays. I want to emphasize Roka red lens glasses are not traditional blue blockers. They do filter out blue light, but they filter out a lot more than just blue light. In fact, they filter out the full range of short wavelength light that suppresses the hormone melatonin. By the way, you want melatonin high in the evening and at night. Makes it easy to fall and stay asleep. And those short wavelengths trigger increases in cortisol. Increases in cortisol are great in the early part of the day, but you do not want increases in cortisol in the evening and at night. These Roka red lens glasses ensure normal, healthy increases in melatonin and that your cortisol levels stay low, which is, again, what you want in the evening and at night. In doing so, these Roka red lens glasses really help you calm down and improve your transition to sleep. Roka red lens glasses also look great. They have a ton of different frames to select from, and you can wear them out to dinner or concerts, and you can still see things. I don't recommend you wear them while driving just for safety purposes, but if you're out to dinner, you're at a concert, you're at a friend's house, or you're just at home, pop those Roka red lens glasses on, and you'll really notice the difference in terms of your levels of calm and all the sleep stuff I mentioned earlier. So it really is possible to support your biology, be scientific about it, and remain social at the same time, if you like. If you'd like to try Roka, go to roka.com, that's ROKA.com, and enter the code Huberman to save 20% off your first order. Again, that's roka.com and enter the code Huberman at checkout. Okay, so we've talked about all the sensory information coming in from behind the ear, from deep in the ear, from the body, coursing up past nodose ganglion into the brainstem. I told you earlier, and it's still true now, that 85% of the vagus nerve pathways are sensory in nature, carrying chemical and mechanical information. So what about this other 15% of the vagus nerve that is not carrying sensory information from the body, from the head, into these brainstem nuclei? By the way, when I say brainstem nuclei, I don't mean nuclei in the context of one neuron. This can be a little bit confusing, but when we hear about the nucleus of a neuron, we mean the area that generally contains the DNA, and we're distinguishing it from the axon and the other parts. When we hear about a nucleus in the brain, these neuroanatomists should have been more creative, but when we're hearing about a nucleus in the brain, it means a collection of different neurons, so a big group of neurons. So when I say brainstem nuclei, I mean a lot of neurons, thousands of neurons in little clumps there that we call nuclei. So